Professor Oates used to say, stand up and talk loud.
Can you see him in the...
That would be too close, but I may move.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
I don't want to knock his face.
More, raise your hand if you can't hear when you get started.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. First, before we get started, would you please check your phones and anything else that makes noise and turn it off?
I'm going to move some.
I know that we have a very large crowd today because we have an excellent speaker, my friend Alan Kraut, who is a regular member of MICA and regularly attends Torah study and always has many intelligent things to say, and I'm sure he will today. He's a university professor of history at American University and a non-resident fellow of the Migration Policy Institute. He specializes in immigration and ethnic history and the history of medicine in the United States. He's the author or editor of 9 books, which, if I can see the titles, I'll read them for you, and many scholarly articles. Some of his volumes include The Huddled Masses, The Immigrant in American Society, 1880 to 1921, Silent Travelers, Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace, which was published in 1994, Goldberger's War, The Life and Work of a Public Health Crusader, a study of the U.S. Public Health Service physician Dr. Joseph Goldberger's investigation of pellagra in the early 20th century South. The early 20th century South. Okay. Silent Travelers won the Theodore Salutis Prize for Immigration and Ethnic History of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Goldberger's War received the Henry Adams Prize of the Society of History in the federal government, and the Arthur Visseltier Prize by the American Public Health Association. In 2007, he and his wife Deborah co-authored Covenant of Care, Newark Beth Israel and the Jewish Hospital in America. And in 2013, he published Ethnic Historians and the Mainstream, Shaping America's Immigration Story. He's currently writing a history of xenophobia and nativism through American history. His research has been supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Institutes of Health. He is a past president of the Organization of American Historians and is the current president of the National Coalition for History. He's an elected fellow of the prestigious Society for American Historians, and in 2017, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Alan Kraut.
It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. When I'm at Temple Micah, I'm at home. And so it's good to see so many friends in the audience this afternoon. I want to thank Jerry and Barbara and Robert and Sid Booth and all those who invited me and followed up, and it's great to be here. It really is. Thank you so much. This afternoon I'm going to talk about a subject that I think is terribly, terribly important in our country's history, and especially right now. And that is the issue of immigration and anti-immigrant sentiment in American history. This is Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus wrote a poem. Most of you know a little bit about that. Back in 1883, it was a poem called The New Colossus, which linked the Statue of Liberty, a gift from France, to the whole subject of immigration. This is very near and dear to my heart because one of the things that I do in my career is I chair the History Advisory Committee of the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island project. We will be opening a new museum on the Statue of Liberty this coming May, and so I've been spending a good deal of my fall reading scripts, and right now my committee is working with ABC News and Walt Disney Productions to do the orientation film that every visitor will be shown when they arrive at the museum. It is Emma Lazarus, though, who really made the connection between immigration and the statue. The statue is a gift from France. It was understood as a celebration of the end of slavery in America. It was understood as a bond over the subject of liberty between these two nations. But until Emma Lazarus came along, it really wasn't equated with the subject of immigration. But as you and I both know, there is a plaque at the base of the statue that has one stanza of an otherwise rather ordinary poem. But this stanza is one we all know and we all remember, and many of us were taught this and committed it to memory as early as the 4th grade. That's when I learned it. Give me a tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. What beautiful words. And words that have been very, very important in our country's history. Over the course of our history, the foreign-born have become part of our nation through territorial purchase, through conquest, through annexation, through enslavement. But immigration has been and remains a fundamental chapter in the history of America's peopling. There is no question about that. We celebrate those who came, who worked hard, who built our country. Many prospered, but not everybody. And today, while some folks would like to slam shut the golden door, others celebrate the continuing contribution of immigrants and refugees to our national prosperity. The current governing legislation that governs our immigration policy was passed by the Congress in 1965, the Hart-Celler Bill, named for Philip Hart from Michigan and the beloved Manny Sella from Brooklyn, New York. I'm from the Bronx, but I still have a lot of respect for him. And it changed the nature of the flow of immigration to the United States from the countries of Southern and Eastern Europe and parts of Asia to what it is now. Mexico, China, the Philippines, Vietnam, El Salvador, Cuba. These were not major players in the early part of the 20th century, or the late 19th century, but they became so after the 1965 legislation. The 1965 legislation also had an unintended consequence, and that is by imposing, for the first time really, a quota system on Mexico. It encouraged those who wanted to come to the United States to adopt an illegal or undocumented route. And a good deal of our current dilemma over undocumented immigrants coming to the United States is a direct result, an unintended consequence of the 1965 legislation. All of this is to say that this is a very, very complicated picture. And in spite of all of its complications, the contribution that the foreign-born have made to our economy is enormous. By 1972, 86% of the scientists and engineers and 90% of the physicians and surgeons coming to the United States were coming from less developed countries. Today, the United States issues more patents, which is evidence of innovation, than any country in the world, and immigrants have received about a quarter of them just in the past decade. At Intel, one of the largest makers of semiconductors, 40% of the patents are for work done by Chinese or Indian immigrants. Immigrants create patents at twice the rate of native-born Americans because they disproportionately hold degrees in science and engineering. In the middle of the past decade, foreign-born students received 40% of science and engineering doctorates and 65% of computer doctorates in the United States. That's extraordinary. So While many will return to their home countries, many will continue their relationship with the United States and its economy by staying here or communicating long distance via the internet. Immigration has long nurtured our prosperity, and I have every reason to think it will in the future. Still, in spite of everything that I just said, many times in our nation's history, there has been sharp opposition to the arrival of immigrants in the United States. The negative views of Mexicans, which we heard during the 2016 campaign, the ongoing trope of Islamophobia, are hardly unprecedented in American history. And I was working on a very different book in 2016. I was writing a book on the history of assimilation to the United States. But right after the election, my phone started to ring with a lot of newspaper reporters. And I was doing a lot of stories across the country, and I did a Q&A for Atlantic Magazine, and they all wanted to know the same thing. Had anything like this, in terms of the outpouring of nativism, ever happened before in American history? And the answer, emphatically, is yes. That, in fact, if one wanted to properly characterize the history of the United States, it is an ebb and flow of these kinds of feelings. This is John Higham. John Higham is sort of the grandfather, if you will, of studies of nativism in the United States. He created three categories of what he regarded as nativism to be followed by other scholars: anti-Catholicism, racial nativism, anti-radical nativism, and later in his life, later in his career, he added anti-Semitism as a separate category. So 4 categories of what Higham at least thought of as nativistic categories. Today, there are many, many scholars looking at nativism. My take on nativism is that it occurs more frequently at certain moments in American history than at others. It's never totally absent, but there are moments when it kind of peaks. And historians disagree as to what those moments are. Some, for example, associated with economic recessions. I look at it more broadly. From my perspective, it has to do with moments of fear. And sometimes the moments of fear are inspired by economic circumstances. But at other times, the moments of fear are spiked or spike because of other things that are going on in the society. Cultural challenges, large, unusual numbers of immigrants coming into the United States from particular places, national security threats. And so what I'm doing in the book is taking a look at all of American history and taking a look at all of the different expressions of nativism in different time periods, at different moments, and in responses to what I call different fears. And I'm going to give you just a short look at this afternoon. Otherwise, we'd be here for, maybe a day or two. And I'm going to start with the period prior to the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, there was a tremendous amount of reaction against Irish Catholic immigration to the United States. The founders had certainly commented on their concerns about immigration. Jefferson and Hamilton, way before the Irish started to arrive, expressed their concerns that immigrants would be coming from societies that had kings and had not had a commitment to democracy. And they certainly voiced those concerns. But the big outpouring of nativism, the really big expression of it, begins with that Irish Catholic migration. It begins with a trickle in the 1830s and picks up in the 1840s and 50s. And one of the people who spearheaded that outpouring was this person, Samuel F.B. Morse. See, you had the right reaction. You were surprised. Most of us think of Samuel F.B. Morse and, of course, the telegraph, what we think of the Morse code. But Samuel F.B. Morse was, without question, about as anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant as they come. He was born in Charlestown, Massachusetts, the eldest child of a Protestant clergyman, the Reverend Jedediah Morse, a staunch Calvinist who appears to have made anti-Catholicism part of his legacy to his son. And the son wrote the following: "It is a fact that Roman Catholic priests have interfered to influence our elections." Does that sound familiar? What Morse's point was is that Catholicism, because it had a foreign priest at its head, the Pope in Rome, was inherently anti-democratic in many different ways, and that Catholic priests in the United States were actually a subversive force. Not only did he offer examples of what he thought was interference in American elections, but he pointed out that the priests often, from the pulpit, tried to influence the vote of their congregants. And this, too, he found very, very offensive. He wrote, "It is a fact," he always started the sentence, "it is a fact that politicians on both sides have propitiated these priests to obtain the votes of their people." So all parties were trying to get the priests to steer voters in their direction. Morse was hardly alone, though. This person, Samuel Busey, was right here in the Washington area, in Washington, D.C. He's a physician, and very much the nativist. He wrote, "An examination of the hospital reports and statistics exhibits too plainly the sources of much of the disease which infects the large seaboard towns and cities, and which is from thence propagated throughout the surrounding country. Too often," he said, "foreigners are transferred directly from the immigrant ships to hospitals." He noted that in the cities, those direful and pestilential diseases, ship fever, yellow fever, and smallpox, are almost exclusively confined to the filthy alleys, the lanes, the streets, the low, damp, filthy, and ill-ventilated haunts, which are exclusively tenanted by foreigners. In other words, in a sense, he was blaming the victims. He was arguing that it was their fault that they were sick, and their fault that they were spreading their sickness to native-born Americans. And what was the import of that? Well, not just the fact of being ill, but if you were ill, if you were enfeebled, you certainly wouldn't be able to earn your way in society. You wouldn't be able to be a contributing, economically productive member of society. And so Busey and Morse and many others complained about that, and complained about it bitterly. There was backlash. And when people today talk about acts of violence on both sides, foreign-born and nativists, one might well look at the antebellum period in the 19th century. This is an act of nativist backlash. It is the burning of the Ursuline convent by an anti-Catholic mob in 1834. In Philadelphia, a decade later, in 1844, controversy broke out over which version of the Bible ought to be read in schools. It became the so-called Bible riots. Catholics opposed any Bible readings if Protestants insisted that the King James Version be read. And so in 1844, riots in the Philadelphia subdivision known as Kensington, some of you know Kensington, erupted, and there were gunfire. It was gunfire from the windows of nearby buildings. Nativists were killed, and a mob of nativists retaliated by storming the Catholic seminary of the Sisters of Charity. Several nativists lay dead at the end of all of this. Dozens on both sides were wounded and injured from beatings. And this violence that I'm describing is not unusual in the 19th century. It happens again and again and again. Nativism spilled into the political arena as well, especially in the 1850s. there was a new party formed around anti-immigrant sentiment called the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party. It was formed in the 1850s, and in some states, these nativist Know Nothing Party members amassed enormous power. In the state of Massachusetts, Know Nothings controlled all but 3 of 400 seats in the state legislature. That's incredible. Excuse me, incredible. The violence of the 1830s and the 1840s was repeated in the 1850s by Know-Nothings and their Catholic opponents. Violence erupted in response to Know-Nothing rallies in Louisville, Kentucky, Baltimore, Maryland, as far north as Ellsworth, Maine, where a priest was actually tarred and feathered by nativists, including members of the Know Nothing Party. Now, the Know Nothings were around from the early 1850s to the mid-1850s, and then they merged into a new political party, the modern Republican Party. In 1855, Illinois politician Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to a friend of his in Springfield, Joshua Speed, and this is Joshua Speed, and he wrote the following: "I am not a know-nothing, that is certain. How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? When the know-nothings get control, our Declaration of Independence will read, 'All men are created equal, except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics.' When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy." End quote. So even then, in 1860, Lincoln ran on a platform, the Republican platform of 1860, that came out against any change in America's naturalization laws or any state legislation by which the right of citizens hitherto accorded to immigrants from foreign lands shall be abridged or impaired, and in favor of giving a full and efficient protection to the rights of all classes of citizens, whether native or naturalized, both at home or abroad. In other words, the Republican Party came out on the side of the angels, if the angels include incorporating the foreign-born into American life. Now, not all of the nativists in the pre-Civil War period were white Protestants. Free African Americans saw millions of arriving foreign-born as rivals for employment. And those free blacks who were engaged with the abolitionist cause, like Frederick Douglass, saw the European arrivals as competitors for the attention of white Christian reformers, whom they hoped to persuade to support not just slave emancipation, but full rights and liberties for free black people living in the United States. Douglass, of course, was the best known of these. He lectured around the country and abroad. He spent 2 years in Ireland and England between 1845 and 1847. He had a very warm relationship with the Irish in Ireland. But he resented, with tremendous energy, the deference shown to Irish immigrants politically in the United States. In 1855, he wrote, "If native-born colored Americans experience the same treatment at the hands of the national and state governments as aliens do, we should not have so much about which to murmur and complain." And after observing that black Americans were, some of us, descendants of those who fought for our country, who bled and died for it in the Revolution, Douglass denounced in the strongest terms the bad treatment of even free blacks in the North. And then he issued a demand. He said, "We say unto our white fellow citizens, treat us well as you treat the foreigners swarming in your midst. Those who fill your jails and almshouses, as well as build them. Extraordinary statement. Notice the swarming part. That's become a matter of considerable issue in current rhetoric. Especially vexing to Frederick Douglass was the denial of suffrage to free black males in the North, a matter that, of course, would not be resolved until the 14th Amendment. He wrote, "The colored man cannot be an alien, for aliens, we believe, are not born in the country. He cannot be naturalized, as foreigners only are naturalized. Not a citizen, not an alien. In the name of the Constitution, what is he?" End quote. That was a good question. And in a touch of irony, after all of this, Douglass implored our Irish fellow citizens not to be offended by his remarks. But, just to bring the story to a conclusion, after the election of 1860, when Lincoln won and the state of New York rejected inclusion of African American suffrage in a referendum that was part of the vote, Douglass went ballistic. He characterized the outcome as the vote of drunken Irishmen and ignorant Dutchmen, by which he meant Germans. So European Catholic immigrants were not the only targets. Chinese migrants arrived in the 1850s, lured by the possibility of discovering gold in California. Very few found gold, but many found employment as mine laborers on the railroads. In railroad labor camps, they often cooked, they did laundry, those were their jobs. By 1870, there were 50,000 Chinese, most of them in California. And native-born Caucasian Americans in California hated the newcomers. They hated them for their appearance, and they hated them because the district of the cities where the Chinese lived were all often dirty, smelled bad. There was prostitution and gambling there. It's interesting, when I was doing research for an earlier book, I came across an ad denouncing Chinese prostitutes for corrupting the morals of innocent young men, who, as it turned out, were taken by their fathers in many instances to the Chinese prostitutes to finish off their education, I guess. Some feared that the Chinese who retained the queue, the long braid in the back, which is there as a sign of deference to the emperor, continued to wear the queue because they really had no intention of becoming a permanent part of the United States and practicing American democracy. And so there was a great deal of concern about that. The reaction to the Chinese was most definitely violent. There was a riot in 1871. White mobs in Los Angeles engaged in a day-long slaughter that left 18 Chinese shot or lynched. This is a picture of the bodies. The economic depression of 1873 led to even further scapegoating of the Chinese. In town after town, workers drove out the Chinese, burned their homes to the ground, and often left the occupants dead. In 1885, in Rock Spring, Wyoming, there was a massacre of Chinese coal miners who had been hired to work in the mines during a strike. 28 were killed and another 15 wounded. The leaders of the strikers shouted to the miners, "White men, fall in." Sound familiar? Not unlike what we heard in Charlottesville. White men, fall in. A grand jury that was convened did not bring a single indictment against any of those. Because immigration was a matter left to the states in the 19th century, defining the proper role of immigrants in the United States was a constant on the floor of state and territorial legislatures. Many of us don't realize that the federal engagement with immigration is a fairly recent occurrence. It began very slowly with little pieces of legislation in the 1870s, becomes full-blown in the 1890s, and ever after. But before that, it was the states that controlled immigration. Many of you know the Castle Garden facility at the tip of Battery Park in Manhattan. It's where you go to buy your ticket to go out to the Statue of Liberty. That big stone structure was once the New York State Immigration Depot. And New York State officers manned that depot. Not federal officials, but New York State officials. And so it was the states that were in the forefront of policing the borders. But the states responded to immigrants in another way as well. In 1859, Oregon rewrote its constitution to read that no Chinaman, that's the language, no Chinaman can own property in the state. 3 years later, in 1862, President Lincoln signed into law the Homestead Act, which allowed settlers to claim up to 160 acres of land on which they promised to live and to work. But included in the language of the law was provision that homesteaders either be citizens or have filed for citizenship. And since later Chinese were forbidden from acquiring citizenship, it in effect excluded the Chinese. By 1879, Californians were campaigning in Congress to shut down Chinese labor migration altogether. The state revised its constitution to limit land ownership to aliens who are, quote, from the law, of the white race or of African descent. Soon, other territorial legislatures on the West Coast, such as Washington, would seek to exclude those from land ownership who could not become citizens. And since the Chinese couldn't become citizens, that was it for land ownership. Following the 1882 Chinese exclusion law, legislation that forbade the Chinese from coming and then forbade them from becoming citizens, a law that would stand in that regard until 1943, basically excluded the Chinese from every aspect of civic life in the United States. By the 1880s, nativism was scoring again and again and again with respect to the Chinese. And the Japanese were not left out of this either. Teddy Roosevelt negotiated with the Emperor of Japan a so-called gentleman's agreement just between them, which basically shut America's doors to Japanese migration as well. But the doors did remain open for Southern and Eastern Europeans who were coming to the United States in ever greater numbers. Among them, of course, Eastern European Jews. Overall, between 1880 and the 1920s, 23.5 million immigrants came. Between 1890 and the 1920s, 2.25 million of them were Jews, mostly from the countries of Southern and Eastern Europe. The nativist writers feasted on this. Part of the response to this big new migration was, of course, the construction of Ellis Island. This is the Ellis Island main building, as well as buildings like it in every Atlantic port, in every seaport, basically, including on the West Coast, Angel Island. The Jews represented, though, a special problem for nativists. Jews in the sweatshops, Jews living in coal cellars like this poor guy, Jews who wanted to make the transition from immigrant to American. This is one of my favorite slides. It's a before and after picture of this gentleman. One of the most virulent and vocal nativists was E.A. Ross. E.A. Ross was a professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin and the author of a 1914 book, The Old World and the New. It was Ross who coined the term race suicide. And he did not hesitate to launch specific attacks on particular groups, and one of his absolute favorite targets were Eastern European Jews. Ross was born in Verdun, Illinois, the son of a farmer. He attended Coe College graduated in 1887, studied in Germany for a while, then returned to the United States and earned a PhD at Johns Hopkins in political economy. He was an extremely, extremely smart person. It was Ross who regarded the Jews with special skepticism. In fact, if you read not just this book, The Old World and the New, but some of the other things that Ross wrote, he approaches the Jews with a combination of fascination and true disgust. They had, in Ross's view, an incomparable herding instinct, an inborn love of money-making. The Jew, unlike the Gentile from Eastern Europe, did not gravitate toward heavy labor, which Ross definitely held against them. He observes the Hebrew immigrants rarely lay hand to basic production. In tilling the soil and growing food and extracting minerals, in building, construction, and transportation, they have little part. Sometimes they direct these operations. Often they finance them. But even in direct poverty, they contrive to avoid hard, muscular labor. A lot of Ross's generalizations echoed a much older anti-Semitic trope. On the one hand, Ross credited the Jews with intellectuality. On the other hand, they seemed to him to love profit more than learning. He wrote, "What is disliked in the Jews is not their religion, but certain ways and manners. Chief among those manners was an overzealous ambition." He said, "The Gentile resents being obliged to engage in a humiliating and undignified scramble in order to keep his trade or his clients against the Jewish invader." And again, this notion of the invader, the swarming invaders. Physically, Ross regarded the Jew as inferior to Americans. He writes, and this is one of my favorite passages, "On the physical side, the Hebrews are the polar opposite of our pioneer breed. Not only are they undersized and weak-muscled, but they shun bodily activity and are exceedingly sensitive to pain." He quotes a settlement house worker, "You can't make Boy Scouts out of the Jews. There's not a troop of them in all New York." Now that I know is not true. Another remarks, "They are absolute babies about pain. Their young fellows will scream with a hard lick. Students observe husky young Hebrews on the football team lack grit and will take on if they are bumped into hard." Because how did they get on the football team? Anyway, but Ross doesn't let those details get in the way of his broader analysis. He is hardly unique. One could go on, I will mention only one other, and that is Madison Grant, an attorney, a world traveler, a conservationist, a founder of the New York Zoological Society, one of the champions of the Bronx Zoo, a trustee of the American Museum of Natural History, and one of the creators of the National Park System, with his very close personal friend, Teddy Roosevelt. In 1916, Grant published The Passing of the Great Race. He wrote that just as a Syrian or an Egyptian freedman could not be transformed into a Roman by wearing a toga and applauding his favorite gladiator in the amphitheater, so it would be impossible to transform into an American the Polish Jew, whose dwarf stature, peculiar mentality, and ruthless concentration on self-interest are being engrafted upon the stock of the nation. If it had just been words, if it had just been these characterizations, that might have been bad enough. And moreover, since we have no real data on how, who read what and how frequently these were circulated, it's hard to gauge their impact, at least for somebody who values data as I do. But one of the things we know is that it often translated into policies, including policies at some very, very important institutions in the United States. This is A. Lawrence Lowell. He is one of the people who championed quota systems at Harvard University. What Lowell did at Harvard was echoed at Yale, at Princeton, at Columbia, at many, many other institutions all around the country. Lowell described what he had as a Jewish problem, because the percentage of Jewish undergraduates had tripled from 6% in 1908 to 22% in 1922, and a proposed quota system would limit the number of Jews to 15% per year. Notice the Chinese are fighting this battle right now at Harvard. The restrictions failed thanks in part to student opposition, but it was well known that there were quotas at these institutions. As late as the early 1960s, I remember a guidance counselor at my high school alma mater, Bronx High School of Science, saying it's okay to apply to Harvard, it's okay to apply to Yale, but don't waste the ink on Princeton if you're a Jew coming from New York City. And that was the early 1960s. So these things continue to have a valence well beyond the 1920s and the 1930s. So there's no doubt that these anti-Semitic prejudices aimed at new arrivals contributed mightily to the imposition of restrictive legislation. Between 1905 and 1914, 9.9 million immigrants were counted entering the United States. In 1896, and again in 1913, legislation requiring a literacy test for all newcomers was passed by Congress and vetoed by presidents. But it was vetoed twice more during World War I, once in 1915 and once in 1917 by Woodrow Wilson. Now I know, don't even have to look at your faces, Woodrow Wilson has a mixed reputation these days, and deservedly so. He was a Southern man, or the son of a Southern minister. No one segregated Washington, D.C. racially more than Woodrow Wilson. And yet, there was another side to Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a champion of immigration to the United States. Twice, he vetoed bills calling for a test of literacy for newcomers. Congress overrode the second veto in 1917, 287 to 108 in the House and 62 to 19 in the Senate. And the literacy test became national law. Wilson described the literacy tests as not tests of quality or of character or of personal fitness, but tests of opportunity. Those who come seeking opportunity are not to be admitted unless they have already had one of the chief opportunities, the opportunity of education. The object of the provisions was not selection, it was restriction. What's amazing about this whole episode is that Wilson, in his first term, was a very popular president. He also came in with majorities in both the House, both houses of Congress, but he could be so little regarded by Congress just 3 months after his re-election that they could override his veto. And so anti-immigrant sentiment overrode the affection for Woodrow Wilson, and it was made clear that Americans wanted to call a halt to mass migration to the United States. By the way, the law was never very effective. And the reason why was because in the negotiation over which languages one could show literacy in, negotiators managed to include both Hebrew and Yiddish. And moreover, if you were the wife of an immigrant or the daughter of an immigrant, you did not have to demonstrate literacy. It's only men who had to demonstrate literacy and women who were single. Everybody else could come in on someone else's shirt tails. And so there was legislation, but nativists really didn't regard it as adequate. And in the aftermath of World War I and the Russian Revolution, nativist pressure for restriction increased and increased a lot. There were raids on the homes of radicals and their offices by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer in 1919, a response to the concern that Eastern European immigrant anarchists and communists would destabilize the government of the United States, and seemed to lend a kind of immediacy to the debates over immigration restriction. We in our own day are not at all unfamiliar with the national security argument. It went on and on. Many radicals were deported. The Assistant Secretary of Labor, Louis Post, called the trend the deportation delirium of 1920. And post-war deportations included over 3,000 in fiscal 1919, almost 3,000 in fiscal 220, and a whopping 4,500 in fiscal 1921. And the numbers were growing. There was more and more pressure to restrict, to stop. Between 10,000 and 20,000 foreign-born radicals were being deported every year between 1926 and 1933. And often the evidence of their radicalism was really quite thin. Many of those deported, like Emma Goldman, this is Emma's mugshot, were of Jewish background. And so it only heightened, in a way, anti-Semitism in these policies, because now radicalism and Jewish identity were being equated almost routinely in terms of calls for restriction. By 1921, there was a push for at least temporary restriction with a quota system. And one Republican congressman, Albert Johnson of the state of Washington, was the chair of the House Committee on Immigration and made some very unflattering comments to the effect that there was great danger in admitting to the United States a sea of abnormally twisted and unassimilable Jews who were filthy, un-American, and potentially dangerous in their habits, end quote. That's an extraordinary characterization. My favorite is the abnormally twisted. Some reason I identify with that. So the first national origins quota bill is passed in 1921 and repassed in 22 and in 23. And what that legislation did basically, it said that each country that had a presence in the United States could have in each year 3% of the number already in the United States as its quota for immigration for that year. So 3%, and the base year used was 1910, right in the middle of the peak immigration period. But for real nativists, those in Congress and those outside of Congress, that was not nearly good enough. And so the greatest victory occurs in 1924. Because in 1924, our friend Albert Johnson and his colleague, Senator David Reed of Pennsylvania, managed to push through a quota system which called for 2% of those already in the United States. But here's the key. The base year was to be the census of 1890. Not 1910, but 1890. And by 1890, the Jews were just beginning to come. The Southern Italians were just beginning to come in large numbers. It did exactly what Johnson and Reed wanted it to do. It brought down dramatically the numbers of people from those groups in Southern and Eastern Europe who were coming to the United States. Who supported it? Not surprisingly, the Immigration Restriction League, which was comprised of kind of upper class types from the Boston, New York area, the Ku Klux Klan, no surprise there, and the American Federation of Labor. Politics makes strange bedfellows, because the AFL, including Samuel Gompers, wanted an end to immigration to the United States, which would be supportive of their protests for higher wages for American workers. How did you boost those wages? Keep out new, low-paid immigrant labor. So the AFL, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Immigration Restriction League become allies in this. And it passes the Congress without a hell of a lot of problem. The Johnson-Reed bill was the subject of tremendous debate, and there were some who wanted something even more extreme. This is Thomas Heflin from the state of Alabama. Heflin called for a total suspension of all immigration for from 2 to 5 years. As he put it, to crush the spirit of the communist, which is the deadly enemy of the American home and of all Christian civilization, end quote. When the debate occurred, there were many who spoke up on the other side, not the least of whom was Rabbi Stephen Wise. Rabbi Wise said that he opposed the bill. He regarded it as degrading, as extemporaneous and unscientific, his words. And then what he said was even bolder. He said, under such a scheme, Jesus and the apostles would have to draw lots to see who could come to the United States. I'm sure that remark was held dearly by Albert Johnson and David Reed. In the end, the Johnson-Reed bill became law. It was signed into law by Calvin Coolidge, and this is a picture of Coolidge signing the actual legislation. In the House, it was passed. 164 Republicans were joined by 157 Democrats. In the Senate, 32 Republicans found 28 Democratic allies. Clearly, this was both sides coming together in agreement on limiting immigration to the United States. It took some time before the law was fully operable. In fact, it took actually a committee from the American Council of Learned Societies to finally calculate the final disposition, what quota each country would have. It finally went into effect in 1929. 5 years it took of negotiation. And of course, something else happened in 1929 that affected migration to the United States, the beginning of the Great Depression. And then it was up to Herbert Hoover to turn to the State Department and not wish to go back to Congress and re-debate this, but ask the State Department to use administrative means at the offices of the various consular officials to limit migration, which they did and did quite enthusiastically. And so there we have it, because it is the 1965 legislation that revised this 1924 legislation that is still the ranking legislation that governs current policies to the United States. My friend John Hyam, who sadly is no longer alive and who I mentioned to you earlier in my talk, had a saying. He said, history may move in cycles, but never in circles. And that's true. Nativism resurfaces periodically in the United States. Often, I would argue to you, in conjunction with periods of extreme national insecurity. The target changes from era to era. The target is no longer Eastern European Jews. The target is people from certain Muslim countries. The target is the Mexicans. Whatever the target is, it is a new cycle that we are in. And there are new nativists to go along with it. The late Samuel Huntington, who wrote the book, Who Are We?, making the case against Mexican migration to the United States. Patrick Buchanan, who writes articles and books frequently on the subject. And, of course, Richard Spencer. Appropriately, his finger pointing outward, Spencer has become a very popular speaker, unfortunately, on college campuses all over the country. Today's nativists and their arguments, I would argue to you, echo an earlier time. Then, anti-Eastern European Jewish nativists, C.A. Ross, Madison Grant, and so many others, fueled a kind of hyper-nationalism that yielded some of the most restrictive legislation policies in American history. Both then and now, some Americans try to repel the foreign-born, even as other Americans beckon them with opportunity of all kinds and freedom. It is a paradox in a way, and a paradox not lost on the immigrants themselves. In the 19th century, there was an old immigrant saying, translated into many languages. No one knows quite the origins of it. And the saying was, America beckons, but Americans repel. How true. How very, very much, I would argue to you, a constant of the American story. Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions. Sir.
Yes, could you,
We have a microphone coming around.
could you contrast American policies and practices to other countries?
Yes. Some countries are much more generous in their policies and are welcoming immigrants because they want those immigrants to develop their economies. And this is true of some of the Asian countries. It's true in countries, parts of Africa, where development is very, very important. And then there are other countries, many of them are part of the British Empire, that had, from the get-go, much more restrictive policies, and in many cases, highly racist policies. And here I'm thinking of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. In fact, a very good friend of mine wrote a book about the Canadian policies during the 1930s and 1940s, and the title of his book is None is Too Many. Because a Canadian official who was asked about the possibility of admitting Jewish refugees was told precisely that. There would be none, and even none would be too many. So, so there are lots of different policies as you look across the world, a lot of it depending on the agenda of the country involved. And some of us, myself included, in my capacity as a non-resident fellow of MPI, have argued that a rational way of creating immigration policy would be to go back to an old progressive notion of the commission. A commission that would be formed and would meet once every 5 years to set numbers and priorities for admission. What this would do would be basically to ensure that the United States would be able to get who it needs to benefit the economy most, and to try and do this in 5-year periods. And then on top of that, to consider how exactly we determine the need for saving people, our refugee policy. You know, our refugee quota is separate from the immigration quota. And the language that we sign on to in terms of our refugee policy echoes the UN language. And that is, we regard anybody as a refugee who has a well-founded fear of persecution. This system, while the language is not bad, really doesn't provide a mechanism for determining that is in any way efficient. And that's why we have such a backlog as we do. We don't even have sufficient immigration judges to sit and hear the cases of people who are trying to make the argument for refugee status or asylum. And so part of my ideal overhaul would be to consider that separately from the larger policy governing all immigrants of what's good for America, economically and in other ways. Yeah.
In your studies,
Mike.
Ron Wall. In your studies, did you look at, or have you looked at Europe under the EU open borders, and whether that provided, because of the free flow, if that provided the effective workforces, the reduction of discrimination and the integration of peoples from various countries prior to the refugee problem?
I was actually involved in a radio program with somebody from the EU and someone from the UN High Commission for Refugees, and that subject came up. And to be honest with you, I think what happened was it all worked well when the flow wasn't heavy. But as soon as the flow became heavy, everybody said, you take them. You know, we've got too many. And arguments started to break out, as you well know, within the EU. The UNHCR was in no position to mediate those disputes. Didn't have the manpower. All they had was data. They had great numbers, but not much beyond that. And so what you had was a horrible situation where different members of the EU were trying to foist the newcomers off on other members of the EU. I'm blocking his name right now. He was a law professor at Yale University who came up with a plan which at the time was not a bad one. And he said what they could do is pay each other off. He said those countries who were willing to take more refugees and increase the flow of immigration, excuse me, should be compensated financially by the other members of the EU who were undergoing their quotas. The bottom line of this is it's a mess. It really is. They are at each other's throats. They are arguing over the numbers that they can take. There's tremendous resentment, and moreover, there's been a fundamental change, I would argue, in attitudes within the individual members of the EU. I gave a paper in Stockholm in the early 1990s, and I met with a lot of Swedish officials and a lot of other government officials and so on. And the Swedish position and the Danish position reflected enormous generosity. But they always made you understand that everything was fine as long as you, the incoming person, would declare themselves to be a Swede or a Dane. If you agreed that you were a Swede or a Dane and wanted to assimilate as rapidly as possible, that was fine. They were okay with that, but the numbers were very small in the early 1990s. And that generosity completely broke down in the first years of the 21st century. And when I asked someone who I met who had been involved in similar kinds of affairs, what made it break down? He said number one was the numbers, but underlying that was a position on Swedish culture or Danish culture. The Swedes said, we are Swedes. We have a history, we have a culture, we have a language, and it is precious to us. And we have a right to that language and to our culture and to our customs. And anybody who comes into our society who is not willing to conform to that is really not welcome. And so that's where the fault lines are. That's where the argument is. It's numbers, but it's something much more compelling than numbers. It's about how people feel about their identities, what it means to be a Swede, what it means to be a Dane. Now, let me take one more minute to tell you a story. One day I was walking into the hall where this conference was being held, and a little old guy standing by one of the columns, as I passed, went, "Tss, tss." So I walked over to him, and I said, "Can I help you?" And he said to me, "You Jewish?" Now, as a good New York boy, my natural response would have been something like, "Yeah, what's it to you?" I didn't. I go back. And he said, "Me too." He said, let me tell you my story. And he proceeded to tell me his story. He'd been in a DP camp after the end of the Second World War. He had active TB. No country in the world would touch him. He was quite literally a man without a country. And the Swedes took him. So he learned Swedish. He started to publish a magazine on refugee matters in Swedish. And he became, for all intents and purposes, a Swede. And was very happy about that. And he told me a story of someone who came to him and said, "We'd like some money for a Jewish day school." And so he went to a friend of his, a government minister, and said, we need some money for a Jewish day school. He said, there's nothing in the budget for a Jewish day school. It's out of the question. The guy called him back and said, you know, he said, I found some money in an account, and I can funnel it to you for a Jewish day school. It came out of the account used to create asylums for the mentally disabled. And so the little man talking to me said to me, so my friend from New York, what's the moral of the story? I said, what's the moral of the story? He said, to be a Jew in Sweden, you gotta be crazy.
First of all, can you get rid of that picture?
Yeah, I was gonna say that too. Same thing. Ugh.
The other thing I want to point out is you actually gave me by saying 1929 was when they were able to figure out.
Can't hear you. Mike, hold on your face.
The Reed Johnson Act, they really couldn't enforce it till 29.
Not efficiently, no.
I was trying to figure out how my mother came over with 4 kids, where she came over as her father's wife. And I thought it was
It was still happening.
1924, and I said, how could you have done it in 5 years? But it was 1 year.
Yeah.
And then she had to leave, she was pregnant with the 5th, had to leave that one there.
These things happened all the time. There were lots of different ways of getting in very, very small numbers.
The question I want to ask, I actually have a whole bunch, but the idea is in terms of numbers. Yeah, we have numbers today, we have political issues today, but when you really look at the numbers and the legislation that can be passed where we can't pass it, it seems to me the numbers of the anti-immigrants are actually a good deal less than what we had in the past.
The answer to that is we don't know. How could we find out? There are pollsters that try to tell us, but we know from what happened in 2016 that people often don't share their true feelings with people who are doing that kind of polling, either in elections and other ways as well. My sense of it is that the people you hear are the people who tend to be pro-immigration, and they dominate the talk shows, and they're well-organized and very articulate. Very often the opposition to immigration is part of what in an early era of American politics people called the silent majority. And, but the true answer is we just don't know the numbers. We have no idea. We know that somebody was elected president of the United States who had a very negative feeling about some of these groups and articulated it during the course of the election. What does that tell us? We know from congressional races that sometimes the same thing happens, though not in the recent set of elections. What does that tell us? And so the answer is we try to find out answers in different ways, but we don't have the perfect answer to that question. But it's a damn good question.
Yes, thank you. I don't feel that the Democrats have given very effective answers to a lot of the lies and the nativist feelings that are growing. And I'm wondering, throughout history, have there been certain themes or certain responses that have tended to be effective in tamping down the anti-immigrant feeling? And do you have specific suggestions for how perhaps to impact public opinion right now?
That's an absolutely great question. It's one that literally keeps me up at night because I'm constantly looking for sources that I've missed in the 19th or early 20th century that would give me that information. The short answer is there were organizations emanating from both the Jewish community and the Italian community that attempted to answer all of the criticisms. Moreover, the church itself in an earlier period attempted to answer those criticisms. So there was definitely pushback. The American Jewish Committee, for example, would be one organization in the earlier part of the 20th century that pushed back very hard against the anti-immigrant posture. The Italians have the St. Raphael Society and other organizations that did similar kinds of work. So there was most definitely pushback, and there were definitely organizations that made the case. My problem is in finding how many there were and what they did other than write memoranda. That is, what were the programs, what were the details of what they did. And part of it was simply the fact that the Jews at this point were beginning to generate their own elite that could respond to people like Madison Grant, that could respond to people like E.A. Ross as Jews became more powerful within the academy, and who could make the counter argument. But I look forward to writing that chapter. Yes, Elizabeth.
My dad
Elizabeth,
came
just
to
please.
Sid.
I'm coming to this side right now.
Thank you. My father came here in 1900, and my husband applied for a job with the CIA in 1970. We had to find out how my father became a citizen or whether he was. And I was told that he was grandfathered in. I have no idea what proof of citizenship he might have had. Maybe a social security number, but not a birth certificate. And then it occurred to me, listening to you, how do people who were originally nativists claim citizenship?
Well,
Is it-
the ones I'm talking about were born in the United States.
So it's being born in the United States?
Yeah.
Okay.
Especially after the 14th Amendment. Remember birthright citizenship.
Well, I was thinking about the founding fathers, who, you know, and people
By right of revolution.
throughout, before Social Security.
Okay, over here. Here I am. Amy.
Not as fast as I used to.
That's still swift.
Two comments. I'll quickly mention my dad was born on the Atlantic Ocean and never went anywhere to school except in the United States. But in 1940, he couldn't prove his birth spot, so they made him become an immigrant. And my mother was mortified that she was married to a greenhorn. Anyway, that's not my question. And my question really relates to the fact of what happened during the Second World War, when Roosevelt did not allow many of the refugees who needed to be protected into this country. And what were the, not only Roosevelt, but what were the other people that were against the Jews getting in?
Oh, there were a myriad of groups that opposed going against the legislation that was on the books and making special exception for the Jews. The argument that was used most often was that this was a country at war. After 1941, this was a country at war, and Roosevelt's Order 9066, which provided for the incarceration of the Japanese, was done as an act of a president's right in time of war, right? It was part of what we're today sort of using the umbrella term, national emergency. But a war is an actual emergency, and that's why Roosevelt was able to get away with that. Not only get away with it, but was upheld by the Supreme Court. Because it was a legitimate exercise of the power of the president in time of war. As for the groups that lined up against changing the quota system in any way, there were so many of them, not just the Ku Klux Klan, not just the various immigration restriction leagues, but many who felt that the Depression had lasted a long time. Americans needed jobs. Now there was a question of a war and national security issues, and that was a problem as well. Would those Jews entering the United States be in some way, shape, or form a national security threat? And that argument was used a number of times. So for all of these reasons, Roosevelt really didn't have many problems in terms of his policies with respect to refugees, except among the Jews. As the election of 1936 approached, it was very clear to Roosevelt that the Jews were now a very important part of the Democratic coalition. And he started to court Rabbi Wise very, very hard. He invited him up to the family home in upstate New York, right? And the Yiddishists, by the way, made fun of Wise. One in particular who I interviewed for a previous book said, you know, Stephen, you only want to be part of Roosevelt's social circle. And Wise, certainly, if you know anything about Wise and his ego, it was as big as the great outdoors. And he was very flattered by all of the attention that FDR was paying him. After the election of 1936, the behavior of consular officials in terms of keeping Jews out of the United States returned to what it had been in 1932 and 1933. That is, the little window of time in which Roosevelt was trying to court a Jewish vote was now closed. And there would be nothing that Roosevelt would be willing to do until the formation of the War Refugee Board, which went into effect in January of 1945. And Roosevelt did that only under tremendous duress. And the duress was coming from within the administration. Within the Department of the Treasury, there were officials who wanted to go public and denounce Roosevelt and denounce the State Department for stopping information from flowing freely about the full extent of the final solution. And that's what persuaded Roosevelt more than anything else to form the War Refugee Board. During the Christmas vacation of 1944, little man in the Treasury Department named Josiah Du Bois wrote a memo at the request of Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury. And the title of the memo that he wrote was "The Complicity of the United States of America in the Murder of the Jews of Europe." Morgenthau read the memo. He crossed out the title and penciled in "Memo to the President" and had the cover page retyped and sent it to the White House that way. I know this because I interviewed Josiah Du Bois shortly before his death. I was one of the last interviews that he gave. I met him at a diner in New Jersey with my tape recorder, and we talked about what he did, what other members of the Treasury Department did, what the State Department was doing, and so on during this entire period. And it was really quite something. I mean, Roosevelt would not have done even as little as he did in 1945. I am convinced, had it not been the fact that Du Bois said he would resign and make all the information he had gathered public. He got the information he got, by the way, through a leak within the State Department. And the leak came from somebody whose last name was Hiss. Not Alger, but his brother. Whereas one of my colleagues said those Hiss boys never could keep a secret. And it was through that contact that he gathered the information on how much information was being suppressed by the government of the United States in terms of exactly what we knew and when we knew it. And from that day to this, I mean, a number of writers have now written about that. My colleague and I were the first. But nevertheless, it's well known, you know, exactly how little Roosevelt did. You know, the old expression, "it was the least I could do." In Roosevelt's case, that was literally true.
Alan, thank you. I think we've just reached the end of our...
Oh, she had her hand up. Can you want to ask questions?
That's fine. I know you got the time.
I just want to thank you.
It's on. Put it
to your mouth.
I just want to thank you for this wonderful presentation. And it does put today's situation in a bigger perspective and gives me hope that the cycle will
Change.
yes. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
folks, please just give us a minute. We have a couple of announcements to make, and then hold your dirty dishes. There's a place for them a little bit later. Alan carelessly told me he has a little time on his hands, and if you catch him now, off mic, he might be able to chat with you a little bit. You may hate me for that.
But wait till you're finished.
Huh?
But wait till you're finished.
Yes, please. Our next speaker is something of a mystery lady. Mike, thank you. Our next speaker in February, on the 13th, Margaret Hennick, is something of a mysterious figure. If you've seen the brochure or the handout, you'll understand. She actually was a CIA analyst in a very crucial position during the Iraq War and has a fascinating story to tell. Now, please, we recycle. Oh, wait. We have bread to sell. 3 loaves of bread. Anything else for the book? Okay, I think we're through with announcements. Thank you all. You've been great.
Yes. Everybody would take their plates and get out.
I'm gonna let you get to
Jerry, you work so hard for this temple. I so appreciate what you do.
Toby got us, oh my goodness. I'm really gonna have to give you part myself. That was excellent. I feel bad. I can move my chair. I don't want to touch this.
I think I shoved it a couple of times.
I don't think so. No.